Welcome to Access Your Leadership, where we share inspiring career stories and talk about the ways that you can level up your own leadership potential. I'm your host and coach, Hakeem Lakhdar, and today's topic, what are your top animal influencers? Knowing ourselves and others to improve communication. Joining me today is my friend Joe Andrews, a leadership transformer and co-founder of the Training Rock, a company based in the UK working with leaders globally. Joe, so excited to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Hakeem.
My pleasure. So I love starting out each episode, as everybody knows, with that one question of what's one big leadership win that you've had recently?
Oh, I love that question. Do you know, last week I finished working on a leadership training course with a team based in Zimbabwe. And honestly, I wasn't sure how this training was going to land because I've delivered leadership training in lots of different countries, but I have not worked with leaders based in Africa. I've not been to Africa, and I knew that the culture is a bit different. And a lot of the training consists of talking about well-being, mental well-being. We talk about mental health. It's all very much, as you know, Hakeem, it's all very much about building relationships. And yeah, there was some resistance at the beginning. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. But we finished on Friday after 8 weeks of working remotely together. And honestly, I'm still feeling joyous at the journey they've been on and just excited about where they're going to go. And I kind of feel like I can conquer any leadership team now. If I can conquer this team that was so resistant to talking about all of these things that you know that we talk about. So for me, that was a real leadership win.
I love that. I can imagine how they came onto this training thinking like, okay, I roll. Here comes another one of these leadership trainings, and they're not all bought in to start. And then all of a sudden, the animal influencers, which we'll talk about at some point, start popping up, and they're thinking like, okay, what is this meerkat and hedgehog and ostrich? Like, what are we doing here? And then to see them transform over the 8-week period must have been, I mean, obviously amazing for you as a facilitator and the leader of this group, but then also for them to see them and themselves and their peers actually transform. I think
exactly as you say. It's such a privilege to watch them. And at the beginning, I call it the folded arm brigade. Like, okay, what can you teach me?
Yeah.
And to be fair to them, they didn't have too much of that because they're too polite to do that. But there was a little bit of, I guess it was just uncertainty really, because they've never had this kind of training before. But yeah, they got into their animals like so majorly, and we were talking about the traits as you know, and yeah, it was a proper game changer. So I'm truly excited about where that team goes. And it was on Zoom. We got to the end of the session on Friday. You know, when you get to the end of a phone call and you go, bye then, bye. No, you go. No,
nobody
you go
wants
first.
to get off.
Yeah, honestly, nobody wanted to leave. It was like there was proper love in the room. I loved it.
It's so refreshing because I think, again, like I said, people hear leadership training and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to be tapping my foot this entire training, wondering like when it's going to wrap up. And that's the trainings that, I mean, even myself, I've been to and had to participate and lead even to some degree, these very structured out of the box trainings where people are thinking, okay, like, let's just wrap this up so we can all go to lunch. And I've been a part of those. I've seen the transformation. I've seen people leaning into the Zoom camera and wanting more of it. So I think that's such a refreshing approach. And it's so nice to hear that, because leadership development as a sort of personal and professional pursuit is so important. And if people can sink their teeth into what you're delivering, then it really lands in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's so it. And, we talk right in the first session in week 1 about having a growth mindset. Because if you come in with a fixed mindset, this is going to be torture for everyone, actually. Yeah. So yeah, we talk about the concept of it and what it means and how you might recognize whether you're in a fixed or a growth, and have some slightly uncomfortable conversations. Yeah. And you can see people, shifting and thinking, okay, it's going to be actually less uncomfortable to dive in here.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep our conversation today as comfortable as you're comfortable having it. But I want to know more about you. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about Joe and where you got your start, like what your origin story is, like what your journey's been that's taken you to where you are now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, my work life started in finance.
Hmm.
So, or prior to that, I did a music degree. So I'm actually a pianist. I don't play very often anymore, but I do play sometimes. So I got a job in finance, partly because my mother said to me I should get a proper job, but that's a whole nother conversation. And what I realized after having a career at First Direct and a career at American Express was that I was much more interested in the people than I was in the finance. I moved into training, and then I landed my absolute dream job while I was at one of those two companies. I was delivering leadership training literally around the world. The piece of paper of my job description, I could not have written a job description that was more perfect for me. And yet I was really unhappy.
Mm.
I was really not enjoying my job. And it was my leader. I was being micromanaged despite the leader not having my skill set. He had a completely different skill set, and I just felt slightly suffocated. And then I got a different leader. And you know, the first thing she said to me,
Mm.
Joe, what do you need?
It was so simple.
Oh, and I was like, I had this 10-ton weight lifted off my shoulders. And I told her what I needed, which was kind of space to do my job. And that's exactly what she gave me. She gave me space. She checked in with me now and then. When I did need stuff, she was completely there. And I just had a real light bulb moment that we need to save people from leaders who don't have the skills to lead. And often, to be fair, it's not their fault.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't had leadership training. They've been promoted because they're really good at doing their job. And so they suddenly become really senior and they become unstuck because they don't have the skills to develop people and to, you know, ensure that people are supported and motivated and valued and all those things that we know are so important. And so I later got made redundant from American Express. And I just thought, do you know what? I just need to do this. I need to go out there and work with as many different companies as I can to provide that training that so many people aren't doing. And so that was the beginning of the journey that I've been traveling for about 20 years now. And it's yeah, certainly in the UK, and I don't know the stats in the US for where you are, but the average time for people to get leadership training after being put in a leadership position is 10 years. I mean,
Wow.
can you imagine the damage that's done in all that time? And it's just so interesting because the obstacles that you tend to come up against when you're talking to people about leadership training is, oh, we don't really have a budget for that. And yet they find the budget to replace the people that have left because they didn't feel motivated and engaged and valued. And they find the budget to train those people. And imagine the amount of skill and talent and expertise and experience that they're losing because they haven't invested in their leaders.
Yeah.
So my life's work is creating more leaders who really understand what the role is.
Yeah. I so appreciate that you better articulated what I had given as a response to a recent podcast interview that I was in, where they had asked me this very basic question. So why leadership coaching? And I gave them this unsophisticated response of, I hate seeing people unhappy at work. I genuinely physically am pained by hearing stories about people being unhappy at work. And when you trace that back to what's creating that unhappiness or that discontent at work, it often goes back to poor leadership. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, rather than giving every uncomfortable, dissatisfied employee a big hug and telling them that it's going to be okay, I'm just going to go right to the source, and I'm going to go right to these leaders, and I'm going to work with these leaders one-on-one to hopefully transform how they see their role as leaders, not only so that we can improve the lives of those that they lead, but so they can enjoy leading too. I mean, I like the leaders who I see being the most effective in their roles are ones who understand that it's a privilege, that it's an honor to lead people, that they have greater impact beyond what they're doing, you know, sort of on the day-to-day business side of things, that these people who they lead take these feelings and these interactions and relationships home with them. And when leaders can enjoy the role that they play as leaders, I think they end up being so much more effective. So I love the work you're doing. I think it's amazing to hear how through your own career ups and downs, you identified the strength of yours to support leaders in a way where they can actually lead effectively.
We learn from the downs, right? I mean, the ups are great, but the downs is where we learn. We
Yeah.
learn from our failures, and that actually, that's one of the things I talk about in fixed and growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, a failure is the end. In a growth mindset, the failure is a signpost. Like, okay, so next time I need to, and I think that, my experience of having a really poor leader, I'm full of gratitude for now, because it helped to set me on the path that I was meant to be on. And I know I can still feel that intense weight that I carried of trying to do this job and also trying to, be his direct report. And it was so intense,
Yeah.
and a massive feeling of relief and release when I had a leader who got me, and who trusted me.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
She trusted me to go and do what I was, my role.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, it reminds me, I was having a conversation with a client recently, and I didn't frame it in the context of growth mindset. And I probably should have, honestly, but that's what we were talking about, because we were talking about the challenges that he's having with a particular leader, and his leader, is creating a dynamic that's been quite challenging for him. And he's saying, well, what about my growth? What about my development? I said, listen, the growth and development that I've experienced in my own life, my own career, has come from the leaders who weren't all that great, actually.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
learning how to navigate those relationships, learning how to manage up, learning how to communicate effectively based on their personality type or the way that they led, taught me more about what I was capable of doing, and ended up creating my own style of leadership and my own leadership philosophy from that experience that I then use when I was leading others.
Yeah, totally that. And do you know what that reminded me of? Before I landed that job that I was just talking about, I was leading a team in a call center. So I was the leader. I had 12 people in my team, and I thought I was a really good leader. And about half the people in my team thought so too. And we really got each other. And I was like, well, I don't know what's wrong with the rest of them, but these guys get me, and they're achieving amazing results. And of course, it was only a bit later, when I started looking at leadership and understanding leadership more, that I realized that the people who were really performing and responding well to me, to my leadership, were the people who had similar behavioral traits to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wasn't conscious of that. And now I realized, so clearly, that the people who weren't responding to me well, and of course it's not that way around, it's people I wasn't responding to well,
Yeah.
had different behavioral traits, and I didn't recognize it, and I didn't understand it, and I certainly didn't know how to adapt my leadership style to what they needed.
Yeah.
And so that informs lots of the work that I do now. It's really about self-leadership first. Let's understand what my traits are, really truly, not just the surface, but really what drives my behavior.
Yeah.
And to understand the people that I work with.
Yeah.
It's almost like, we all wear glasses, right? We've all got invisible glasses on, and we have to understand what lenses we see the world through. And so if you're talking to someone else, you have to understand not just what lenses you're seeing through, but what lens they see the world through too, so that you can adapt according to, both traits that are in the room.
Yeah, I love that visual too. No pun intended. But I mean, like, I do love the idea of all of us having our own unique view of the world, and our role in it, and who we are in it.
Yeah.
And I think there's that piece. And then what I also heard you say earlier was, and then the way that we approach people or situations has an impact too. And understanding who we are and how we behave and its impact on others, not only those who are like us in terms of their personality, but those who aren't like us. What's the impact on them, and how can we adjust how we show up and how we communicate and how we behave, so that we can be most aligned with the majority of people, especially when we're thinking about managing a team, so that we can get the best out of them. Because I mean, I think about parenting. There are some times where what I'm saying lands in a certain way, and then I realize, like, my boys don't hear it when I communicate in that way. I've got to communicate a different way. But another kid who learns or listens in a different way might have heard what I said the first time and been perfectly fine with it. So adjusting our styles and adjusting the way we communicate, I think, is so important. I want to ask a question about, now that you've gone through your career, you're now leading this group at the Training Rock. What is it about your own experiences and now what you're seeing from companies leads them to want to reach out to you and do this work and not have it just be like a check the box exercise?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because I would say there are four main reasons that companies get in touch with the Training Rock, and that often they've been through a period of really rapid growth in a short time. Sometimes they've been through a really sharp change. Sometimes they have conflict in their leadership team, which has become unbearable. Mm. And sometimes someone has recognized that the culture in the company isn't where they want it to be. So it can be any of those four. And sometimes it's all of those four. Mm. So they're all interlinked. So massive growth equals massive change. That's really difficult. So if the leaders haven't really built strong relationships and understand themselves, there's probably going to be some conflict. And if there's some conflict, that's going to permeate the whole way through. So that's going to impact the culture. So I think it's really understanding that if we don't understand our own part in all of those challenges, it's just too easy to blame everybody else for this being wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And having done this work as a leader and having worked out what was it that I did as a leader that worked and what was it that didn't work, and really understanding where my behavior came from. So why are my lenses this prescription, as it were? It's a game changer. It's like getting a fresh prescription, or it's like getting windscreen wipers on your lenses. It's like, I can properly see clearly now why this is all happening.
Yeah.
I was working in London this week with a team on change. So they have a big change coming, and we started the day and there was massive resistance, really didn't want the change. And the actual change that was going on, I'm not an expert in. What I am an expert in is looking at, why are we feeling like we're feeling? Mm-hmm. What do we need? How are we coming across? What's driving how we feel, and what do we need in order to change how we're coming across? And honestly, it was just, I don't think the leaders in the room got what they expected. I think they thought we were going to talk about all the technicalities of what's going to happen once the change is implemented. And we did talk about it a bit, but it was a 10% of the conversations. Sure. So it's about really understanding what drives our behavior as humans.
Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting that you talk about parenting. I think parenting and leadership there are so many parallels. And I say that as a mum of 3 who are now grown up. But yeah, I think a lot of the skills are so similar.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, and I'm hearing when you talk about the company out of London, it's peeling back of that top layer to kind of expose, like, yes, we're all concerned about the change and we want to talk about the change, but we might just be sort of talking in circles if that's what we talk about. But if we peel that layer back, we actually find that what's driving the anxiety or the worry or the stress that we're all feeling are this, and this, not the actual change. Mm-hmm. So when companies come to you and they offer up their concerns around one of the 4 or even all of the 4, how does the conversation go that in a way that allows them to feel like all hope isn't lost, and that this is actually something that's going to be feasible? Because I think what I find, and I'm talking to leaders, is that especially when they waited for so long to do something, I ask sometimes the question, like, what took you so long to pursue coaching? You felt this for so long, why now? And they realize, like, well, I just sort of was out of ideas. I was out of options. I didn't want to feel like this anymore. And I'm talking on a one-to-one basis. But I imagine the same is true for companies, where they kind of just accept, well, this is just the way it is. This is, it'll work itself out, or it's not that bad, or whatever. But then all of a sudden they get to this point where they're like, okay, this needs attention. Yeah. When they come to you and they have that conversation, how are you reassuring them that this is the right time, this is the right program, all hope is not lost, we can actually make a change?
There's so much to unpack there. I think just going back to one of the things that you've just said about why are people not coming sooner? I think so many leaders are driven by the numbers. So it's only when the numbers start being impacted that they go, oh, it's going in the wrong direction, we need to change it. And yet there were so many red flags before that in terms of people's motivation and productivity, and people are leaving the company, and all of these should be red flags about, okay, we haven't got the culture that we want to have. So by the time they come to me, it's almost, sometimes, not always, some companies come at the right time, which is always now. You're right, there's a desperation for a magic wand, a magic pill solution. And my approach is always, we need to look at self-leadership first. We need to look at what we are doing that's getting in the way, before we can look at what's getting in the way of the company, of the numbers. And in terms of what drives the numbers, it's always humans.
Yeah, exactly.
So any result which was ever achieved has always been achieved by a human. So would it not make sense that we will achieve better results if all our humans in our company are feeling motivated and valued and listened to and heard and engaged and used in the way that they thought they were going to be used when they applied for the job? And I think there's often this absolute almost obsession with, but my job's a leader and my job is to produce the results. And yes, of course, but who produces the results? It's not you personally, it's your team. So surely if you can lead your team to get them working close to their potential, they're going to achieve so much better results. And so if you believe that theory, that your people will achieve your results, it's not a theory, if you understand that concept, then that's something that I can absolutely help you with.
Yeah.
If you trust me, if you trust me and you're happy to be vulnerable and you need to be honest with me, then I can help transform your leadership skills so that your people will achieve your results.
Yeah. I love that. The episode that I just published today actually was all around ego and leadership. And one of the areas that I was talking about was the impact of ego on our willingness to be honest about what's going on, because we're so afraid of the fact that it could reflect back poorly on us. And if we're working so hard with this inflated ego and this ego that's running the show to curate and project a certain image of who we are as a leader, if we say, well, hey, hand up, I could use a little bit of leadership help, what does that say about me? And
well, I mean, that you've just hit the nail on the head. You've so hit the nail on the head. And when we're busy building our ego, it's usually because we think we're going to be judged if we don't, and we have to appear to be the leader that's got all our ducks in a row and we've got everything together. And I see ego as the opposite of trust. So I think every conversation that you have, you're either building your ego or you're building trust. And I don't think you can be a leader without trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Training Rock is growing and you're now a leader of leaders and a leader within your own organization, how are you finding that experience? And how are you also, this is sort of a two-part question, how are you finding that experience now being a leader within your own organization, bringing on more people, but also how are you finding time and carving out time to pursue your own personal and professional development?
There's probably two parts to that. So part of the reason that I'm taking on leaders is so that I can have time to pursue my own stuff, because it got to the point where I, unless I could clone myself, then I really have no family time, no time for personal development, no time for any of that. So to answer the second part first, because I'm taking on new trainers, I've recently had the opportunity to go on a course myself as a delegate rather than being the trainer at the front of the room, which was just fantastic. So I went on a week's course, residential, to become a workplace mediator. So it was around, helping people whose relationship has completely broken down through unresolved conflict. So lots of parallels with the work that I do in terms of addressing conflict, but in a slightly different forum. So that was fantastic, and actually a brilliant reminder of what it's like to be on the receiving end of training. And I always say to my leaders that I work with, listen, you might feel like you haven't done any work today because you haven't been at your desk doing the numbers, but you'll probably be really tired tonight because I'm asking you to think in a different way. And I do always say that. When I got to each evening, when I was on this training, honestly, I'd go back into my hotel bedroom and I was just lying on the bed. My brain was like, and I know this stuff, right? It was a different angle. So it was fabulous. It was fabulous learning and development, but it's not something that's completely alien to me. But that reminder of what it's like to, listen a lot all day and take on that new information, it was fantastic. Yeah. And I guess the other leadership thing recently was, for me, it's all about personal development all the time, right? Leadership is a never-ending, or self-leadership is a never-ending journey. And even doing this work with the team in Zimbabwe, for me, that's personal development. It's always just pushing myself slightly out of my comfort zone and challenging myself to do stuff that I haven't done before. And I think, the day we stop doing that is the day that we should stop doing what we're doing. Yeah, I think we have to keep growing. Yeah. And then going back to the first part of your question, how has it been taking on other trainers? I mean, it forces me to implement everything that I talk about in leadership. And the trainers that I'm taking on have different behavioral traits to me, intentionally so, because I have a certain skill set, I have certain traits which are really useful, and there are some traits that I don't have. And so it's interesting because the people that I work with all have a similar top trait, which in terms of our animal influences, which we'll talk about in a minute, they're all quite creative. And whilst I can be creative, it's not my default mode. So it's working with people who think and behave differently, which is fantastic and brings with it its challenges. So it's me really walking the talk.
Yeah. Well, it's keeping you sharp. It's like,
absolutely.
Iron sharpens iron, right? I mean, you're bringing in people that you want to work with, but people that will also challenge you to be your best self. And I think, when I think about how the leadership journey is for each individual, and I know it's unique for everybody, one thing that I constantly hear from people is it's challenging. I think it can be challenging. It can be tiring. And I think some people would argue, well, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have to be. It's not about this being sort of exhausted beyond, functionality, but it's this understanding that you are thinking with a different part of your brain. This isn't just executing for executing's sake. There's an understanding of the layers that exist out there in the world, to people, to conversations, to conflict, and understanding our part in that takes some extra effort, some extra thought, some extra time. And when you can put that into how we show up in the day, we might feel a little bit more fatigued at the end of the day, but it does get easier because it is a practice. It is something that people have to dedicate themselves to. And when leaders are committed to that, I have seen leaders transform before my eyes, either as clients or in my own career. I've watched leaders come in and struggle right from the bat, and then they dive right into, okay, if I'm really going to make it, I've got to do this, this, and this to improve my leadership. And you watch it transform. But I think that it says a lot about you that you're willing to put yourself out there, not only for those that you work with, but for your own growth and development, so that you can be the best leader for your team, and then be the best leader by example as a facilitator when you're doing these trainings.
Otherwise it's all a bit it's all a bit unreal and a bit it's a bit surface, I think. If you're not actually doing it,
right? And that's the check the box thing I was talking about.
Exactly that. And I think one of my favorite things that keeps me on track is when we say nobody is intentionally difficult, we are intentionally different. And so when we're having one of those tricky moments of why are they behaving like that, which we all have, right? It's remembering that it's because they're different. They think differently to me. They have different traits. They're driven by different things, and that's okay. And I need to understand what's driving that. And remember, there's no bad intention on their side.
Yeah. And this is where I talk about diversity and the importance of diversity, and I talk about it with clients and colleagues in the context of race and ethnicity and gender and all that. But there's also diversity as in like neurodiversity and diversity of backgrounds and experiences and ideas and opinions and feelings and levels of sensitivity. I mean, that diversity exists as well. And I think it's important for us to recognize that across the spectrum, so that I love that, nobody's intentionally difficult. We're just different.
I mean, it does sometimes feel like they are, right? I've been married a
Yeah,
long
sure.
time. Can I just say that?
Of course. So as you think about the work you're doing and the landscape of leadership in the years to come, how have you seen leadership evolve, and where do you think the area of leadership development and what leaders need to be in the world today is headed?
That's a really interesting question. Do you know, I think there's been more of a shift in leadership in the years since COVID, in the last maybe 2 years, well, maybe during COVID, let's say the last 4 years, than I've seen in the last, let's say, 15 years. Because leaders have had to start seeing their employees as human beings. They've had to. So that whole thing of seeing cats on keyboards and toddlers in the background, and the doorbell rings and it's okay to go and answer it, which we would never have done before COVID. We'd be scared of being seen to be, I don't know, weak or unprofessional or something. And I think what's really interesting now is the challenge that employers are having and leaders are having around, do we work in the office? Do we go back to work? Can we do hybrid? Do we do a mix? Do we do flexible working? What even is flexible working? What are the rules? What if Johnny wants to be in work full time, but Susie wants to be at home 3 days a week? And how do we make all of that? And the thing that is that for the companies where it's working, they have trust. For the companies where it's not working, they're mandating that this is what you have to do.
Yeah.
And there's, exactly as you've said, there's no respect for the diversity and the different needs and all of that kind of thing. And so I think that, to answer your question, I think going forward, we are evolving to understand that leadership really is about building relationships. It really is about trusting our staff. And of course, there are boundaries. And we need to know how to manage those boundaries. And when someone steps out of them consistently, then yeah, of course, you need to go down a different route.
Sure.
But that really should be the exception. You think about some of those recruitment processes where there's 5 different stages to get a job. So we're really rinsing you and making sure that you're amazing, that you've got the skills and the experience and the expertise and the specialisms. And then you get into the job and we suffocate you. And we don't let you work to your potential. How are those two things? I mean, how can both of those two things be going on? Yeah. So if we're going to pay you good money to be the amazing person you are, then let's lead you to be that amazing person. Yeah. And a lot of the time that means let's trust you to do what you've done. Because actually, hopefully, I've taken someone on who has different skills to me. So why would I try and micromanage you? And I think that recognition, certainly in the clients that I've been working with, there has been big steps forward in recognizing that that is what leadership is about, not about cracking the whip, not about rewriting the handbook and making the rules clearer, but about understanding that relationships are so much more important than results because they achieve the results.
Yeah, you're talking my language here, obviously, because you're talking about the humanity of leadership. So before I ask my last question, I have to ask them the question, if we're talking about the humanity of leadership, why animal influencers? What are the animal influencers, and how do they feed into this understanding of the value of relationships and really breathing in the humanity to what leadership needs?
Going back to what I said earlier about lenses, and we all see the world through a different lens, and we all think we're right? We all think we're normal. We all think that we've had a normal upbringing and that our way is the right way, and we're all different. And so when I started working in this field, I wanted a tool that would help us to understand what the lenses are that we see the world through. And I couldn't find what I was looking for. I wanted something that was, based in science, based in psychology, that was very easy to use, very easily recognizable, doesn't require a degree in psychology or, to have to read a manual to use it. And so Katie, who's my co-founder, and I came up with animals, and we started looking at the 9 archetypes. And that, it's based in Carl Jung, so there's 9 established archetypes. And we just had this idea about using animals, and we thought, is there an animal that fits each of the archetypes? And it just came so easily. It was so clear that that's what we needed to do. So to give you an idea, my top 3 are cheetah, which is about being driven to achieve results and, succeed, which is great. As with all the animals, they're all based in fear. So for the cheetah, the fear is underperforming, which is what drives me to. And so the work is around understanding your fear, right? What does it mean in this particular situation? So that's what a lot of our work is on the leadership course. So my top one is cheetah. My second one is lion, which is about being direct and straight talking and calling a spade and making difficult decisions, driven by a fear of loss of control. And when that gets out of control, then the lions can become a bit confrontational and intimidating. And then my third one is dog, which is the people pleaser. So I like to think that my dog keeps my lion and my cheetah tamed, because I do like to look after the people. And so on. And, there are others. There's the meerkat, which I think you mentioned earlier, which is the protector. So, making sure that everyone's okay. But for the meerkat, when their fear is triggered, they can become a little bit overprotective and a little bit anxious and a little bit suspicious. So all of them have real strengths. So there are often I get asked, which is the best one? And there isn't a best one. The best leader is the person who really understands their own fears, and so they can manage their vulnerabilities, and they understand the traits of the people that they're working with, because that means that they can see the lenses, both sets of lenses, and then they're talking the same language. So if we go back to no one's intentionally difficult or intentionally different, when you understand the animal traits, it's so much easier to see that they're really not being intentionally difficult, and you understand why they're coming from the angle that they are.
Yeah.
And it's my starting point for all of my training, because that's like holding up a mirror to see what you're doing that gets in your way.
Yeah. And
everyone else's way too, probably.
And does everybody have the opportunity to get those top 3 that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. That's open to everyone. That's a free tool, because I just thought, the number of people that have said to me, hey, you should charge for that. And I'm like, no way. This is a free tool, which is just, I think it switches a light on for a lot of people.
I bet. I'll include that in the show notes then, a link to that, because I think people would love to see what animals pop up for them when they take the test.
That would be great.
Yeah,
that would be great.
So to wrap up, last question, which I always love to ask, is what's one, I think I might know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you answer it anyway. What's one area of particular importance you think leaders should focus on to enhance their own leadership skills?
For me, that has to be trust every time. I think you have to trust yourself, because if you don't trust you, no one else will. And you need to build trust with the people around you. And that is around understanding what drives their behavior, which comes in my book, that comes down to the animals. That comes down to understanding what their fears are, how the fear drives how they behave, and creating that safe space.
And I heard that as a common thread throughout your responses, that trust kept coming up, and I had assumed that might be your answer, because I think it's so undervalued. I mean, they hear trust as in sort of like trust with this big T, but it's like, no, trust with this little T. Like daily practices of like, how are you building and fostering trust within yourself, within your organization, in your home? I mean, what does trust look like to you? And when you realize that is the foundation on which everything is built in an organization, so that that you can establish that and then grow from that, it just gives it so much more weight and so much more value too, I think, to an organization. Yeah, I love that.
Do you know, it's interesting because it's not just in an organization. If you think of all of your relationships, whether it's your romantic relationship or your friends or the people who you have a really good relationship with, because there's a high level of trust.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. I can think back to many relationships where there was not high level of trust,
Yeah,
and those relationships did not go the distance. So
absolutely. And
I
that's the
value
same in
that.
business.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right. So we talked a little bit about Training Rock, but tell us a little bit more about Training Rock, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell people how they can connect with you as well.
So we work with leaders and leadership teams globally they've come unstuck. Any of the 4 reasons that I mentioned before, or indeed any reason that they want to really transform the leadership team to become a cohesive unit who address conflict and know that, as I said before, that they're not being intentionally difficult, they're intentionally different. The trainingrock.com is where our website is. You can take the trait test on there. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find me personally on LinkedIn. And hey, I would love to hear from any of your listeners who have enjoyed this conversation. And there's nothing I love more than people having taken the trait test and wanting to talk about their animals. So I would love to hear from people who do it and have that discussion with them.
Amazing. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for being here. Thanks for your time. I appreciate this conversation. It was wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me. I've loved it.
As always, I'd love to hear from any of you about the episode. What came up for you as you think about leveling up your own leadership game? And please, if you enjoyed the episode, I encourage you to like and subscribe. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn, Hakeem A. Lakhdar, or at lakhdarcoaching.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. Keep being great, and we'll see you next time.